Hey, how's it going? This is James Pack, and I'm here with another episode of The Process going over this digital painting here. It was a lot of fun to do, and let's just go over the process. Let's check it out. All right, let's start off this video by just giving it a little bit of preface. I want to talk a little bit more today about why. The big question of why do we make these choices and why do we make certain decisions along this design journey path? So let's go ahead and jump into this process, but I want to talk a little bit about that big question, which is why do we choose some of the decisions that we make? So let's start off by just jumping into the sketch here. Now, the idea is pretty simple. We've got a squad of patrollers who are walking around this desolate landscape with the intention of patrolling around and looking for enemies to then destroy. The squad is walking around on foot with a couple of mech, I guess kind of like a tank squadron, but with mechs walking through the space as well. So I've been working on these characters sort of on my personal time to just understand a little bit more about character design and just creating a little bit more better keyframing. So I started with, a couple of earlier pieces. I could show you some snippets of those images here. But as I'm working on this sketch, that's what I really want to develop is the sense of this character. So some of the decisions that I'm making here are based on shape language. I wanted to make this character feel a bit like a soldier, something that has modular pieces where other soldiers could also use the same types of shoulder plating and armor. So really my thought is, okay, let me design first an interesting pose that makes the character look like and feel like they're walking through the space. They have their weapon at ready, and they're walking around a little precariously, a little bit more carefully, because not to get seen by the enemy. Right. So I also have different shape language. Now, I also have a lot of influence from samurais. I love the samurai shape language, and also there are bits of samurai reference that I look at when it comes to designing some of the armor for the characters. I want to use very strong shapes like squares, strong recognizable shapes like the primitive squares, circles, and triangles. So that's primarily what I'm trying to do there with the main character. Now, as I design this mech, I have a pretty a solid direction of influence that I have for this mech. It's walking around with 2 feet. It's kind of like what you would imagine in some of the original Star Wars, but kind of has that kind of shape language, right? So I want to design a pose, right, for this mech. One of the things that I want to focus on for the pose of the mech is having the torso and the legs sort of be in a contrapposto, where they're both facing slightly different directions in order to get a little bit more of a sense of movement and making it feel a little bit more natural. So that's kind of the direction of why I'm focusing on the pose of the mech first. I have some general shapes in there that are getting some of the proportions, but I haven't really put a lot of time into designing it that much yet. All right, so as I take this further, now we're going to get into more of the design elements of the mech. Now that the pose is a little bit more figured out, and I feel that the proportions are working well. That's the thing with poses for me is I'm looking at the storytelling in the pose. It's not just something dynamic and it's not just something interesting, but there has to be a narrative, something that drives the pose in terms of the story. Because when we look at people walking around and we look at people's body language, it's always driven by some sort of narrative or an intention, right? So that's what I'm trying to have this do is make the character feel like they're walking around. They're kind of scanning left to right, looking at the terrain for any type of enemies. And I want the mech to also do a similar type of thing. Now, the ground plane isn't totally flat, so I'm really working on making sure that, the slope is a little bit, precarious, and there's a little bit of a uncertainty here, uncertainty. So now we're jumping into color. I have the basic shapes in here, and I know I'm eventually going to fill in the rest of the background with some more of these, with some more of the mechs and some more of the characters, but I'm just going to start with these two first. All right. There's a lot of designing that still has to be done to the two elements, the mech and the character, but I'm going to wait till the painting phase to actually get into the more of the detailed areas of that. All right. So let's talk about the environment, the color. Working on the ground plane in the sky. And if you notice, I started with the sky tone first, going with a really saturated, kind of like a teal turquoise type color. And as I'm working through this environment, what I want to do is just make sure I'm doing a couple of things, which is number one, let me get the sky tone figured out. And then number two, let me get a lot of the, the base ground plane also figured out as well. Now, let me slow this down for a little bit over here. All right. So as we go and I'm painting through this ground plane, I want to make sure that we're focusing on getting these layers to read. The dark shapes and the shadows, those are accents, and they tend to really ground the design. So I want to make sure that those dark shapes are reading really, really well. All right. As you can see now, I'm starting to block in the silhouette of the character and the mech as we start to move along. So this is something that I'm working on right now. All right. And nothing magical here, but just kind of showing you that it does take sometimes this, little bit of laborsome activity to just get this done. All right. So I just want to get the silhouette filled in as quickly and effectively as possible. And as I'm doing this, I'm actually refining the design. These are decisions that I can make now because I'm now worrying about the more, the finer parts of the silhouette and some of the details there. So that's what I'm working on at this moment, filling in all the shapes. Now, having the silhouette allows me to now paint inside of that selection. It's going to save me a ton of time. It's going to save me a lot of headache, and that's definitely worth it. Taking the time to do this was such a big learning curve for myself, which was, doing this kind of feels like you're going sideways a little bit. You're not really progressing the piece. It's almost just extra labor. But man, in the long run for the piece, it saves a ton of time. So highly recommend getting this part done. All right. So let me also pause it right there. Now, looking at this environment, this is starting to get really, really laid in. The dark, medium, and light parts of the foreground, middle ground, background of the environment starting to get laid in pretty well. And I just wanted to also point out a lot of the atmosphere that we're starting to push in here, and a lot of this is just to really drive a little bit more silhouette, right? You can see at the top of the character and the top of the mech, it's more contrast, right? And that area of contrast is something super important that I want to add in here, just to make sure that we're looking at the proper parts of the mech and the proper parts of the character. So filling in the shapes now. As we go through the process, what I love to do is start to develop the shadow accents, using these black accents to carve out and give proper anatomy to the character, to the costume, and to the finer points of the design, right? What I love about this process is that step by step, we're worrying about different things. So when we're sketching, right? If you remember when we're sketching, we're just worried about the pose and general shape language. When we're filling in the silhouette, now we're filling in the silhouette more. We're getting to look at the silhouette more carefully, and we're getting to add in more elements at that point. Now, when we're doing this part of the design, where we're using the darker accents to now really describe parts of the shape language inside of the silhouette, right? This is where, for me, having the ability to have these different phases, it allows me to kind of approach this character design in a more comfortable way, All right. So I just have this character kind of walking through the space. Okay. You can almost imagine, the twisting of the torso a little bit as they're walking down this slight slope. What I just want to really point out is that I'm trying to also worry about proportions here. Okay. Now, this is another part of design with a why. Okay. Why am I deciding to put bigger clumps of dark shapes, smaller thin lines, how is all of this kind of happening? What's the thought process? Okay, so ideally, what I want to think about is big, medium, and small. I want to spread out different proportions of big, strong, dark shapes, medium shapes, and small shapes. I want some of the shapes to be bold and really thick, and then some other shapes to be thin and very delicate, right? So that's kind of the idea, is kind of creating a sense of calligraphy, stylish handwriting almost, when you're doing this kind of shadow shapes and such. All right. Now doing the mech, so it's a lot more right angle, right? It's a lot more perpendicular. So I need to make sure my shapes are really following that type of thing. With the character, it's a lot more volumetric in terms of cylinders. So we're going to get a lot more rounded contour shapes. But for the mech, it's much more angular, at least for this design. So I want to make sure that my mark making is also very intentfully different, right? Making right angles really feel like right angles, and having rounded or kind of curved shapes really feel like that as well. So that's what I'm really trying to focus on here, is getting big, medium, and small shapes, as well as talking about the perpendicular angles, the curves, and that sort of thing. What also happens here is with the dark shapes, we're starting to see a little bit of lighting, right? There's a hint of lighting, at least subtly enough to know where a light direction might be coming from, okay? This is awesome because it helps really anchor in the image at this point, right? Same thing with the ground plane. As we did adding in those dark shapes, we could see how that really comes into play to anchor in that ground plane, right? So as we're working on this, starting to gravitate towards this X pattern on these armor platelets that we're adding onto the character and onto the mech, maybe making it feel like they're part of the same team, or something to that degree. Smaller details, big, medium, and small. All right, I want to start adding in some of the smaller shapes. Number one, to get a sense of scale, but also number two, to get more interest, just visual interest. The big and medium, I think, are really anchoring in the design, and the small are just kind of points of interest, in my opinion, so I want to play around with that. Now here I go, laying in some base coat of tone, right? Just going underneath all of the line drawing and the dark accents, and let's start to base in some local color. Right. So I'm playing around here, trying to think about what's the local color, like a good color combination that might be working. So again, step by step, we're worrying about different things. In this step, it's about the local color. What's the color harmony, So when I'm thinking about this, it's also about big, medium, and small. Is there a color that kind of dominates over the majority? Would it be the kind of the pink, the yellow? Would it be the gray? What would be that kind of 1, 2, 3 proportion, kind of like if when you're dressing yourself, maybe there's different color proportions and stuff like that, 1/3, 2/3 proportions, things like that. But anyway, now you can kind of see that there is starting to become a sense of color proportion happening here, right? At least the armor tones are really popping out. Kind of see those first, right? And so now just trying to get a little bit more sense of material in here. As the details of this character start to come to light a little bit further, I'm starting to push thought process to think about, okay, what should I put on the pants? Okay, what are 3 things maybe that are interesting that I could put onto the pants, right? A colored stripe, a knee pad. Well, that's 2. What's something else? And while my mind is sort of thinking about that third thing, I'm going to jump to another area. So I'm going to the chest plate. What are 3 things? Well, I'm going to add in some cut lines. I'm going to put in some details over here. I'm kind of stuck now, so I'm going to move again. Now I'm just kind of rotating around this character until I can really figure out 3 things that I can put into each major element of the character, and then at that point, I'll kind of analyze it and look at it and see how it looks. Okay. All right. Now just doing a little bit of adjusting, a little bit of correcting as I kind of work through this piece here. Area of the character and the anatomy around this area is just a little bit bothersome for me. So I'm just fiddling with it, seeing kind of how it looks. But let's keep progressing. All right, so far so good. Just getting a little bit of lighting, adding in some accents of color, a little bit of material indication, and I will start to add in a little bit of color accents very, very soon. So even starting with the visor, going with a super fluorescent yellow visor just to grab some attention. And I kind of like this design method a bit where I'm using subdued colors and I'll add in very, very saturated accents, kind of like a way to play around with color harmony. So with that super yellow, fluorescent yellow visor, I'm going to add some accents to the weapon, maybe some other details of writing or, things like that to the rest of the armor and things like that. All righty. So here we go. Let's kind of adjust as we go. Think about more details. Now, I feel like these smaller details are kind of like when you have the analogy of icing on the cake. Majority of the cake is done. We're not going to completely change the design of this character from here. It's pretty set. So a lot of the smaller now tertiary elements that I'm adding to the pants and additional cut lines and things like that. Now I feel like I'm adding enough complexity where it's like adding 1, 2, 3 elements to each major part of the design. So that's what my brain is thinking about, as well as adding in a little bit of lighting. Right? I don't want this piece to be really about crazy lighting and things like that. So just kind of using something very comfortable. Let's put some lettering in here. Thinking of an interesting graphic kind of breakdown. Using a mask to get them all flattened down and paint them in and out with a little bit of, kind of weathering effect. See how that looks. New layer, just overlay with selection of whites, adding in some color accent areas to the design now. Now, even with that little splash of red, it really created a spectrum, brought in another element from the color wheel to add more of a spectrum of color range. Even with that little bit of red, it really helps, So just remember, in the beginning, while we were doing this character, it was very flat. We were just worried about basic colors. But as we progressed and really worried about adding in additional design elements, color accents, and that sort of thing, it really helps. Now, let's go back over here to really look at this mech. I took a quick break and I forgot to hit the record, but let me kind of also talk about the mech. As we go through the mech, it's also the same thing. I went in and established basic proportions of colors. Now we have the gray, which I reserved for certain mechanical moving parts. We have the kind of the tan color, and then the green, right? And right now the green kind of looks like it's more armor based, right? So we're doing like color association, the green tones on the mech all follow maybe a similar idea of material. Feels like armor, feels thicker, and more protected. Maybe the tan is a bit more of, other pieces, and then you have the gray. So at least we're assigning things to make it feel a bit functional, all right? But as it also continues, we're doing the same type of philosophy that we use with the character on to the mech as well, such as color accents and using letters and cropping of those letters to just create interesting design elements. So yes, just doing kind of a similar treatment there, adding in just small accents, again, stripes. It's the same build-up recipe that we use for the character as we're doing for the mech. So I'm working around and trying to adjust this mech, kind of putting it in slightly different types of positions to create another mech standing in the back, maybe another one on the right side, the left side of the composition. Let's also duplicate the character as well to just fill in some more of the space. So now we're starting to get a composition where there's a nice diagonal. There's this nice, very aggressive diagonal wedge that we kind of see from all the characters and the mechs lining up together. A lot of motion going from left to right, all looking in one direction. having this mysterious understanding about what's outside of the picture plane. Still a little bounce light, right? Got little bits of high level contrast that are coming up from the ground. So maybe we can include some of that. At this point, I'm pushing some of the darks back, right? Remember, we used a lot of the darks to establish more of the grounding elements of the design, but the darks were all black. What I like to do as we push elements further and further away is making sure that the darks lighten up and they're not so anchored and heavy, especially further back in the composition. All right, let's play around with adding in, again, more elements, scale. Now, this is where, again, storytelling, modifying and making slight variations to the poses really do help to the authenticity, makes it feel more realistic, But now we're at a point where we're going to start to probably wrap up this image fairly soon. Again, adjusting the darks, right? Adjusting the darks. Now, as I'm looking at this image, squinting my eyes, there's a lot of contrast kind of in between the legs of the mech, right? And there's a pocket of high level contrast between the mech and the character right in the middle. So I want to adjust that. I want to start maybe adding in a different sense of value, just because it's like I'm kind of getting drawn in between the legs of the mech character right now because of the contrast, because of that big graphic open shape, So as I'm working around the composition, I'm keeping my sensitivity to that contrast there. I'm trying to think about it. How can I make it different? How can I adjust it? So let's do to adjust that, as we jump into the next phase of this. So here we go. I'm going to look at just the overall placement of things. And here we go, messing around with a little bit more contrast there, getting it to feel like maybe there's more thicker smoke or atmosphere in that area, and also reinforcing the sensibility of this diagonal movement, right, from left to right. Now, filling in the darker value in between the legs over there actually feels a lot better. We still see the contrast, obviously see, the pose itself, but because the contrast is a few notches down, it feels so much better, and it doesn't draw too much attention to that area. It feels like we're looking at more of the head areas of the mech and the character versus anything else. So going back to that initial intention, making sure that we, keep it going. Now we're getting really close. This is pretty much just all wrapped up. This was a part of my daily painting series. This one is a little bit more involved than some of the other ones. Let me share some of the other paintings here of this same series. It was a lot of fun to do. But this is another episode of the process. Thanks for checking this one out. I would love to do a little bit more. And if you're enjoying a little bit more about sort of the intentions and the why, not just techniques, but the why. I'd love to go into some design, I think, fundamentals and design theory breakdowns that I like to use when I do concept design. So if that sounds good, let me know in the comments, or if there's anything else that you guys would love to get some more information on, let me know in the comments too. But thanks again for joining another episode of The Process and this digital painting right here. All right, guys, take care. We'll see you guys on the next one. Take care.